In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who watched the knuckle on his left hand come apart 3 days ago, slowly, like wet parchment tearing from a binding, the skin thinning to grey translucence, the joint beneath gone iron black. There was a smell. Everything about him smells now. But the thing he wants you to understand, before anything else, is that he watched it the way you'd watch rain slide down a window. Mild interest, patience, nothing resembling pain. That is the gift. That is what the Plague Father gave him when he begged him to make it stop. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Drennic Vosh, born in the underhive warrens of Carfax Secundus, where he worked a trade the administratum has no word for. A dullist, a man who made pain go away for people no medici would ever see. He was good at it, careful, precise, and that care, that particular skill with other people's suffering, was exactly the door through which something patient and loving eventually walked. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
The knuckle on my left hand separated 3 days ago. Not all at once, slowly like wet parchment tearing from a binding. I watched the skin stretch, thin to a grayed translucence, and then come apart in a line so clean it could have been drawn with a quill. The joint beneath was black, not bruised black, not blood black. A rich, deep black, the color of old iron left in standing water for years. There was a smell, naturally. Everything about me smells now. But the interesting thing, the thing I want you to understand before anything else, is that I watched the whole process the way you might watch rain slide down a window. With mild interest, with patience, with absolutely nothing resembling pain. That is the gift. That is what the Plague Father gave me when I asked him to make it stop. I should tell you how that happened. Not because I think you care about me specifically. You do not. I am not important. I am a footnote in the annals of a collapsing subsector, a name that will appear on no scroll, no litany, no roll of the condemned. But I know exactly how it was done to me, every angle of it, and knowing has changed nothing. There was no flaw in it. It was perfect. It was built with love. That is the part no one tells you about Grandfather Nurgle. The love is real. My name is Drennic Vosh. That much I can still confirm, though there are days when the name feels like something I borrowed and forgot to return. I was born in Hive Ulbrast on Carfax Secundus, which means nothing to you unless you have had the particular misfortune of breathing its air, in which case you have my sympathies and probably a lung condition. Ulbrast was not the worst hive on Carfax. That honor belonged to Hive Morgrath in the southern reaches, where the tectonic instability had collapsed 3 of the lower spire levels into a permanent avalanche zone they cheerfully referred to as the Tumble. No, Ulbrast was merely mediocre in its misery. Average. The kind of hive where nothing was quite bad enough to warrant official attention, and nothing was quite good enough to sustain hope. A masterpiece of sustainable despair. I lived in the Sunderway. That was the transitional zone between the lower hive proper and the true underhive, a band of corridors and chambers that had been formally abandoned by the administratum some 4 centuries earlier, but which still maintained partial power and atmosphere recycling. You could breathe in the Sunderway without a rebreather, which made it luxury accommodation by underhive standards, though the air tasted of old metal and whatever chemical runoff was seeping through the walls that particular week. Roughly 20,000 people called the Sunderway home at any given time, packed into hab warrens carved from disused maintenance corridors and junction chambers. There was no Arbites presence, no Ministorum shrine, no Medici station within a 2-hour walk. What the Sunderway had was its own economy, its own justice, and its own professions, most of which did not exist in the lexicon of the administratum. I was a dullist. If you have not heard the term, that is because it is a Sunderway word, and Sunderway words do not travel upward. A dullist is someone who makes pain go away, not a chirurgeon, not a medici. A dullist does not heal. Healing requires resources, training, sanction. What a dullist has is a collection of salvaged neural dampening components, most of them stripped from decommissioned servitors, a working knowledge of the human pain response network, and a willingness to put his hands inside other people's nervous systems without anything resembling proper sterilization. I was good at it. I was not a butcher. I was precise. I was careful. I had the lowest complication rate in the Sunderway, and I charged fairly, and the people who came to me came back, which in my profession was the only credential that meant anything. The forge serfs came with burns that had healed wrong, nerve clusters fused into permanent screaming by scar tissue that no one would pay to have properly treated. The factorum workers came with spinal compression, with joint degeneration, with hands that had been crushed in press stamps and reset by bone setters who knew how to align a fracture, but not how to silence the nerve damage that sang on long after the bone had knitted. The old came with the accumulated weight of decades of hive living, pressing down on frames that had never been designed to last this long. The young came too, sometimes. Children with congenital defects, with growth plate disorders, with the kind of chronic conditions that the mid-hive medici would treat for a price that no Sunderway family could pay in 3 lifetimes. I would sit them in my chair. I would locate the pain, and I would make it quiet. The mechanism was simple enough. Servitor neural dampeners are designed to suppress sensation in specific body regions so that the biological components of a servitor do not interfere with its programmed functions through involuntary pain responses. They are crude instruments. I modified them. I learned which frequencies suppressed which nerve clusters, how to calibrate the field to target specific pain pathways without deadening motor function, how to create localized zones of numbness that would last hours, sometimes days, without permanent damage. It was skilled work, delicate work, and it was, by every standard of Imperial law, completely illegal. Not because it was dangerous, because pain is a resource. This is something you learn in the underhive that the Spire-born never quite grasp. Pain is not a byproduct. Pain is a tool of governance. The Imperium does not want its labor force comfortable. Comfortable workers ask questions. Comfortable workers notice that their shift has extended by 4 hours. Comfortable workers wonder why the child tithe took 6 from their block this quarter instead of 4. Pain keeps people focused on the immediate. Pain keeps the horizon close. A man with a burning shoulder does not think about revolution. He thinks about his shoulder. So when a dullist removes pain, he is not performing a medical service. He is committing an act of economic sabotage. That was the official position anyway, according to the Lex Laboris, though I suspect no RB-test judge had ever actually visited the Sunderway to enforce it. The law existed. Enforcement did not. And so I worked. I had a room. Not a workshop. Not a clinic, a room, 6 meters by 4, carved out of what had once been a water junction access point. I had a chair that I had built myself from salvaged components with adjustable restraints, not because my patients needed to be restrained, but because the dampening process sometimes caused involuntary muscle spasms, and I preferred my patients not to fall on the floor. I had a shelf of tools. I had a storage unit for my dampening coils, which I kept cleaner than anything else in my possession because a contaminated coil could cause neural feedback that would make the patient's pain worse rather than better, and that was bad for business. And I had Osivane. Osivane Kresh was my supplier. He was a thin man with a face like a hatchet left in acid, and he sourced the servitor components I needed from the reclamation yards of the mid-hive. How he got them, I never asked. Osivane had a philosophy about questions, which was that everyone you asked was a debt you might one day be required to repay, and he preferred to keep his accounts clean. He was efficient, he was reliable, and he was the closest thing I had to a friend, which tells you something about the quality of social connections available in the Sunderway. Osivane was also the one who suggested the coils. The dampening process did not simply erase pain, it redirected it. When I applied a neural dampener to a patient's pain pathway, the signal did not vanish. It was captured, stored. The dampening coils held the recorded pain signal like a Vox recorder holds a voice. I had never thought much about what to do with that stored signal. It was waste product, residue. But Osivane had contacts in the mid-hive entertainment districts, and he knew that there were people up there who would pay for it. The sensation market. I do not pretend to understand the appetites of the bored and wealthy. I am a Sunderway man. My pleasures were simple. Hot food, a working lamp, a door that locked. But in the mid-hive, where every physical need was met and every day was the same as the last, there were people who craved novelty with a desperation that bordered on mania. They had tried every narcotic, every stimulant, every neural pleasure device the black market could provide. They were bored of pleasure. They wanted something else. They wanted to feel what the people beneath them felt. Not out of empathy, out of curiosity. The way you might put your hand near a flame to see how close you can get before it burns. Pain. Real pain. Recorded, concentrated, deliverable in controlled doses. Osivane brokered the deals. I provided the product. The forge serfs burned nerves, the factorum workers' crushed hand, the old woman's arthritic knees. All of it, captured in my coils, sold upward to people who would plug the recordings into their own neural interfaces and experience 30 seconds of someone else's agony as a recreational activity before returning to their wine and their card games and their soft, padded lives. I did not feel guilty about this. That is not a confession. That is a statement of fact. I did not feel guilty because guilt requires a frame of reference that the Sunderway does not provide. I was taking pain from people who did not want it and giving it to people who did. Everyone involved was a willing participant. The forge serf got relief. The mid-hiver got his thrill. I got paid. Osivane got his cut. The machine worked. And if there was something obscene about the transaction, about the idea of suffering as a commodity, about wealthy men sampling the agony of the poor the way they might sample an exotic liquor, well, I had a room to heat and coils to maintain, and patients waiting in my corridor, and obscenity was a luxury I could not afford. I was good at what I did. I was careful. I was precise. I maintained my equipment. I served my clients. I did not ask unnecessary questions. I was, in every meaningful sense, exactly the kind of man the Imperium produces in its billions. Functional, compliant, morally flexible, and utterly convinced that the system he served was simply the way things were. That man does not exist anymore. The coils killed him. Not literally. Not at first. But the coils are where it started, and I did not see it coming because I was already inside it. I should explain what happened to the Sunderway. I should explain about the ecclesiarchy purge, and the coils, and the night the air itself learned how to scream. But first you need to understand something about Hive Umbrast that I did not understand at the time, because I was a Sunderway man, and Sunderway men do not look up. We look down. We look at the floor, at the walls, at the patient in the chair. We do not look at the shape of the thing we are standing inside. Hive Umbrast had a disease, not a physical disease, not then, a spiritual one, a rot that had been spreading through the upper levels for decades, quietly, patiently, the way mold spreads through a wall before the surface shows the first stain. There were cults in the mid-hive, pleasure cults, flesh cults, sensation seekers who had pushed so far past the boundaries of normal experience that they had looped around to something else entirely. The Arbites knew about some of them, the Inquisition knew about others, and somewhere in the tangled web of informants and double agents and competing interests, someone decided that Hive Umbrast needed to be cleansed. The purge came in the autumn of my 32nd year. Confessors and frateris militia, a full penitent crusade of the faithful with a cadre of adepta sororitas at its head to do the work that required discipline rather than mere zeal. The local Arbites's precinct did not join the purge, but it did not obstruct it either. They sealed the transit junctions, turned their augurs the other way, and let the ecclesiarchy do what the ecclesiarchy does: cooperation by omission. They came for the sensation cults of the mid-hive, the Slaaneshi covens that had metastasized through the entertainment districts like a cancer with a credit line. They came with flamers and shot cannons and the absolute certainty of the righteous, and they were effective. I will grant them that. They burned out 17 identified cult cells in 6 days. They arrested 431 individuals. They purified 9 hab blocks and 2 entire commercial tiers. But the purge did not stay in the mid-hive. Purges never do. They roll downhill because gravity is the only law that the Imperium enforces consistently. The confessors, flushed with success and running out of identified targets, turned their attention to the suppliers, the black marketeers, the people who had fed the cults their pleasures. The trail of seized records and tortured confessions led from the mid-hive sensation parlors down through the service tunnels and maintenance shafts and freight corridors, down and down and down until it reached the Sunderway. Until it reached me. I was not a Slaaneshi cultist. I want to be very clear about that. I did not worship the Dark Prince. I did not know what the mid-hive buyers were doing with my product beyond the general outline Osivani had described. I was a dullist who sold his waste product to willing buyers through a broker. But the ecclesiarchy does not recognize degrees of complicity. In their doctrine, the man who forges the chain and the man who wields it share the same sin. And when Confessor Rel Vastrade and his purge column descended into the Sunderway, they did not come to ask questions. They came to cauterize. The Sunderway burned, not all of it, not at once, but enough. Rel Vastrade was thorough in the way that only the truly devoted can be. His frateris teams swept corridor by corridor, chamber by chamber, kicking in doors and dragging out anyone whose name appeared on the seized client lists. Anyone who ran was guilty. Anyone who hid was guilty. Anyone who could not produce valid work documentation was guilty, which in the Sunderway meant virtually everyone. The burning was incidental. Flamers in enclosed spaces tend to produce fires. The screaming was incidental too, though it went on much longer than the fires did. I heard them coming. 2 corridors away, the sound of boots and shot cannon blasts, and the particular crackle that a flamer makes in an environment with limited oxygen. I had perhaps 3 minutes. I could have run. I should have run. But I had a patient in my chair, a girl of perhaps 14 with a degenerative spinal condition that caused her constant agony, and the dampening cycle was halfway through, and if I pulled the leads now, the neural feedback would likely cripple her permanently. So I stayed. I finished the procedure. I unstrapped the girl. I told her to go. She went. And then, because I am a practical man and not a hero, I began destroying my records. That is when the coils ruptured. I need to explain what that means. I had, at that time, approximately 200 active storage coils in my workshop. Each one held between 6 and 40 hours of recorded pain signal, depending on the intensity and the patient. Some of them were fresh. Some had been in storage for months, waiting for Korrvaine to arrange a buyer. The total accumulated content of those coils represented years of human suffering, compressed and concentrated into a shelf the size of a munitions crate. Burns, breaks, chronic degeneration, post-surgical nerve damage, the slow grinding ache of bones worn down to nothing, the white-hot shriek of severed tendons. All of it, hundreds of patients, thousands of hours, every variety of physical agony that Hive Ulmbrast's lower reaches could produce, and it could produce quite a lot. The coils were designed to be inert, passive storage. They did not emit, they did not radiate. They held their contents the way a vial holds a chemical, sealed and stable. But that stability depended on the coils being intact and the concussive blast that knocked in my workshop door, the one from the breaching charge that Confessor Vestrade's forward team had placed on the junction 2 chambers over, sent a shockwave through the floor and walls that knocked 14 of those coils off the shelf. 12 of them survived the fall. Their casings held. 2 did not. I do not know the precise technical mechanism by which a ruptured neural dampening coil discharges its stored content. I am not a tech adept. What I know is what I witnessed. The 2 coils cracked open on my workshop floor, and the air changed. Not the temperature, not the pressure. The air itself became something else, something that carried a weight and a texture that air should not have. It was as if the room had been filled with an invisible liquid, warm and thick, and the liquid was screaming. The first wave hit me in the chest. Not a physical impact, a sensation. Bone-deep, rolling, nauseating pain that did not belong to any part of my body. It was in my ribs, but it was not my ribs. It was in my teeth, but it was not my teeth. It was the recorded memory of a forge serf whose hands had been caught in a press stamp 8 months earlier, and it played through my nervous system like a devotional hymn through a vox caster. Every note clear, every detail preserved. I felt his fingers break. I felt the bones splinter. I felt the hot metal kiss the skin, and the skin peel back from the muscle, and the muscle cook against the bone. Then the second coil's content arrived. I fell. I do not remember hitting the ground. I remember the floor pressing against my face, and the floor being the only real thing in a universe that had become entirely composed of other people's worst moments. The 2 coils had contained between them roughly 60 hours of high-intensity pain recordings. They discharged in approximately 9 seconds. 9 seconds. 60 hours. I will let you do the arithmetic. The discharge was not contained to my workshop. Neural dampener technology operates on frequencies that propagate through conductive materials. The walls of the Sunderway were metal. The floors were metal. The pipes and conduits and structural supports that held the whole district together were metal. The pain signal propagated. It radiated outward from my workshop like a shock wave, weakening with distance but still potent enough to reach every chamber and corridor within a 300-meter radius. The Sunderway screamed. Not figuratively. 20,000 people, give or take, felt the discharge. Most of them experienced it as a sudden, stabbing phantom pain, a flash of agony with no source that lasted a few seconds and then faded. Unpleasant. Terrifying. But survivable. The people closer to the epicenter got it worse. Within 50 meters of my workshop, the pain was strong enough to cause seizures. Within 20 meters, it caused unconsciousness. Within 10 meters, it caused permanent neurological damage. And at ground zero, in the workshop itself, it did something else entirely. I was the epicenter. The signal passed through me first, before it reached the walls, before it propagated outward. Every recorded hour, every captured scream, every meticulously stored instant of human suffering passed through my nervous system on its way to everywhere else. I was the conduit, the amplifier. And my nervous system, already modified by years of working with dampening technology, already tuned and calibrated to receive and interpret pain signals with unusual clarity, absorbed the discharge with a fidelity that should not have been possible. I did not lose consciousness. I wish I had. Instead, I experienced the full content of 2 storage coils, sequentially, at the speed of neural propagation. I felt every patient I had ever dulled, every burn, every break, every torn ligament and compressed vertebra and necrotic wound. I felt the girl with the spinal condition, the one I had just released from my chair. I felt the old dock worker with the crushed pelvis. I felt the child whose growth plates had fused wrong, whose every step was a negotiation with agony. I felt them all, not as memories, not as abstractions, but as lived experience, happening to my body all at once, overlapping, layered, a symphony of suffering played on an instrument that had been specifically built to receive it. When it was over, the pain did not stop. That is the part that the chirurgions could not explain. The discharge lasted seconds. The coils were empty. The signal had propagated and dissipated, but my nervous system, having received the full, unfiltered content of 60 hours of high-intensity pain recordings, did not return to baseline. The signals had imprinted, burned in. My neural pathways, tuned by years of dulling work to be exceptionally receptive to pain frequencies, had absorbed the recordings so completely that they could not distinguish between the stored signal and genuine sensation. My body was fine. My nervous system insisted that it was on fire. The Frateres teams found me on the floor of my workshop, screaming. They did not arrest me. They did not need to. I was not going anywhere. Confessor Vestrade himself stepped over me on his way to the next corridor and did not spare me a second glance. I was, to him, simply another casualty of the purge, another sinner brought low by the Emperor's justice. He did not know that the screaming had nothing to do with his breach charge and everything to do with 200 credit chits' worth of salvaged servitor components lying in pieces on my floor. They took me to a Medici station. The ecclesiarchy had established a triage point at the entrance to the Sunderway, mostly for their own casualties, but they processed civilians too if they looked damaged enough to die without treatment. I looked damaged enough. I was not, of course. My body was intact. But the screaming and the contorted posture and the bitten-through lip convinced the triage chirurgeon that something was very wrong, and so they strapped me to a gurney and wheeled me in. I spent 4 days in that Medici station. They ran every diagnostic they had. Blood panels, nerve conductivity tests, cranial scans. Everything came back normal. My body was functioning within expected parameters for a healthy male of my age and background. There was nothing wrong with me. The pain was not real. except that it was. It was the most real thing I had ever experienced, more real than the gurney beneath me, more real than the chirurgeon's hands on my arm, more real than the light and the noise and the taste of the sedatives they kept pushing into my veins, which did nothing, which could do nothing, because you cannot sedate a nervous system that is replaying a recording. You can only wait for the recording to end. It did not end. They discharged me after 4 days. Not because I was better, because they needed the bed. The purge was still ongoing, casualties were mounting, and a man with no visible injuries who would not stop screaming was not a priority. They gave me a bottle of painkillers that had no effect, and a referral to a mid-hive neurological specialist that I could not afford, and sent me back into what remained of the Sunderway. They wished me the Emperor's protection. It was the most useful thing they gave me, which is to say it was worth nothing at all. I will not describe the next weeks in detail. There is a limit to what suffering can communicate through language, and I reached that limit somewhere around day 3. What I will tell you is this. I did not sleep. I could not eat without vomiting. I lost weight until my ribs stood out like the frame of an unfinished ship. I tried to fix myself. I found a working dampener in the wreckage, one of the few the purge had not destroyed, and I pressed it against my own skull and fired it. Nothing. The pain was not a signal being transmitted through a pathway. It was the pathway itself, rewritten, overprinted. You cannot dampen a frequency that has become the wire. I tried chems next, bought with the last of my credit from a Sunderway scavenger who looked at me with the expression people reserve for things they expect to find dead in the morning. The chems did nothing. Everything did nothing. I sat in the remains of my workshop and I screamed until I had no voice left. And then I sat in silence and the pain continued, and I clawed at my own skin until I bled, because the bleeding was a different pain, a real pain, a pain that belonged to me. And for a few seconds the new pain overwhelmed the recorded pain, and I could think clearly. And then the recording surged back and drowned everything, and I was gone again. People came. The few Sunderway residents who had returned after the purge, picking through the wreckage for salvage. Some of them knew me. They brought water. They brought food I could not eat. They spoke to me in tones of concern, and then fear, and then pity, and eventually they stopped coming, because there is a radius of suffering beyond which sympathy cannot maintain itself. I was beyond it. I was a thing in a room that screamed, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, and eventually they stopped trying. Korrvaine did not come. I waited for him. He was my supplier, my broker, the closest thing I had to a friend. He knew where my workshop was, he knew I was in trouble, and he did not come. I found out later, or I believed I had found out later, that Korrvaine had been taken in the purge, arrested, processed, shipped to a penal work colony on Carfax Secundus's northern continental plate. He had simply been in the wrong corridor at the wrong time, carrying components that he could not explain to a confessor who did not want explanations. That was the story. I accepted it because it required no questions, and Korrvaine had taught me well about the cost of questions. What matters is the woman. She came on the 17th day. I know it was the 17th day because the medici at the triage station had given me a chrono along with the useless painkillers, and I had developed the habit of checking it obsessively, measuring the passage of time in increments that felt like geological ages. 17 days since the discharge, 17 days of unbroken, unrelenting, full-spectrum agony that had not diminished by a single degree. 17 days since I had last known what it felt like to simply exist without wanting to die. She came alone. She walked into my ruined workshop as if she knew exactly where it was, as if she had been there before, though I was certain I had never seen her. She was old, not elderly, not decrepit, old in the way that hive people get old, where the age is in the eyes, and the way the shoulders carry themselves rather than in the specifics of the face. She wore a heavy overcloak of brown fabric, patched and mended many times, and beneath it I could see the edges of what appeared to be a work smock of the kind worn by low-hive sanatoria attendants. Her hands, when she reached out to touch my shoulder, were thick-fingered and rough, and covered in a network of discoloration that I initially took for chemical staining. She said, "You are Drennic Vosh, the dullist." I could not answer. I was between screaming fits in one of the brief troughs where the pain receded just enough to allow breathing, but speech was beyond me. I nodded. She sat down on the floor beside me, not on the chair, not on the debris, on the floor, cross-legged, as if we were old friends meeting for a drink. She looked at me, and her expression was one I had never seen directed at me before. Not pity, not horror, not the uncomfortable guilt of someone confronted with suffering they cannot alleviate. It was recognition. The way you look at someone who has finally arrived at a place you have been waiting for them to reach. "My name is Tethys Grawl," she said, "and I know what is happening to you. I know because it happened to me once. Not the same way, not coils, but the same shape, the same geometry. Pain with no source, pain with no end, pain that the Emperor's servants cannot explain and will not treat." She leaned closer. I could smell her then, and the smell was wrong, not unwashed, not chemical, something organic and old and thick, like soil that had been turned after a long rain. It was not unpleasant, it was just wrong, misplaced, like finding a flower growing through a crack in a bulkhead wall. "I can make it stop," she said. I did not believe her. I want to be clear about that. I was not a credulous man. I had spent my entire professional life manipulating pain through technology, and I knew, with the certainty of experience, that what was happening to me was a neurological imprint that no technology I had access to could erase. The recordings had burned into my neural architecture. The only way to remove them would be to destroy the nerve pathways themselves, and that would leave me paralyzed, mindless, or dead. Tethys was offering none of those things. She was offering something else. And even through the pain, even through 17 days of unbroken agony that had worn my capacity for rational thought down to a thin, frayed thread, I understood what that something else was. I understood what she represented. I had lived in the Underhive long enough to know that when someone offers you the impossible, the price is always your soul. I should have told her to leave. I did not. And I want to be precise about why, because it was not weakness and it was not belief. It was arithmetic. I was a man who had spent his life doing cost calculations on other people's nervous systems, and I ran the same calculation on myself. On one side, my soul, whatever that was worth, which in the Sunder way was not a currency anyone had ever paid me in. On the other, an end to 24 days of being burned alive by ghosts. I knew what she was. I knew the price. And I found that I no longer cared what killed me, only that something did, soon. A man who has stopped fearing damnation has already lost the only argument the Imperium ever taught him. So I stopped telling her to leave. But the pain did not stop, and Tethys did not leave. She sat with me through the next screaming fit, and the one after that, and the one after that. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She held my hand while I convulsed, and her grip was steady and warm, and I could feel it, which was remarkable, because I could feel very little that was not pain. She was the first physical sensation in 17 days that registered as something other than agony. The warmth of her hand, the pressure of her fingers, real, present. Not a recording. She came back the next day, and the next. Each time she sat with me, held my hand, and spoke to me in a low, even voice about things that had nothing to do with pain or faith or gods. She told me about her childhood in a different hive on a different world. She told me about a garden she had once tended, a real garden with real soil, in a hydroponics bay she had been assigned to maintain during a stint as a menial worker on an agri-transport. She told me about the way roots find their way through rock, slowly, patiently, without violence, breaking nothing, simply growing into the spaces that already exist. She never mentioned Nurgle by name, not once in those first visits. She never spoke of chaos or the ruinous powers or the Plague Father. She simply sat with me and was kind, and in the landscape of absolute suffering that my existence had become, her kindness was the only landmark. On the fourth visit, she asked me a question. Drennic, when you dulled your patients, when you took their pain away, what did you feel? I thought about it. The answer came with difficulty, dragged from beneath layers of screaming nerve signals. Nothing, I said. I felt nothing. It was a procedure. She nodded. And your patients, after the dulling, what did they feel? Relief. Yes, relief. The most precious thing in the universe, more valuable than throne gelt, more valuable than status or power or the Emperor's own grace. Relief. She paused. You gave that to hundreds of people, Drennic. You gave them the one thing the Imperium would not, and the Imperium burned you for it. The Imperium did not burn me. The coils did. The Imperium sent the purge. The purge ruptured the coils. The coils ruptured you. Cause and consequence, Drennic. The Imperium creates pain, and then it punishes the people who try to take the pain away. That is not justice. That is a machine designed to produce suffering, and you were caught in its gears. I did not argue. I could not. The pain was building again, the next wave approaching, and I did not have the capacity for theological debate. But I heard her. In the small, quiet space between the waves, I heard her. And the thing she was saying, the shape of the argument she was constructing, had a terrible, simple logic to it that I could not dismiss. The Imperium creates pain. The Imperium punishes those who ease pain. Therefore, pain is the Imperium's product, its purpose, its sacrament. And if that was true, then any god who opposed pain, who offered relief, who reached down into the screaming dark and said, "Rest, child, rest. You have suffered enough," was not the enemy of mankind. He was the only friend mankind had ever had. Tethys came back the next day, and the day after, and on the seventh visit she held my hand and she said, "There is someone who can hear you, Drennic. Someone who listens to exactly this kind of prayer. The prayer you do not know you are already praying every time you scream." And I said, "Yes," not because I believed, because the pain had not stopped. 24 days, not 1 second of relief, not 1 moment of peace. The painkillers did nothing. The self-harm worked for seconds. Sleep was impossible. Food was impossible. I was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a lamp dies when no one refills the fuel. My body was consuming itself. My muscles were wasting. My organs were beginning to strain under the constant stress of a nervous system locked in permanent emergency state. The Medici had given me weeks, maybe a month, before systemic failure. I said yes because the alternative was dying in agony on the floor of a ruined workshop in a district that no longer officially existed, and even the worst bargain in the galaxy was better than that. Tethys smiled. It was genuine, warm. The kind of smile that reaches the eyes and the corners of the mouth simultaneously. The kind you cannot fake. Whatever else she was, whatever she served, whatever monstrous thing wore the face of her faith, she cared about me. I could see it. I could feel it in the steady pressure of her hand. "Then let me take you home," she said. She took me through parts of the Sunderway I had never seen. Down. Always down. Past the last functioning lumen strips into corridors lit only by the bioluminescent fungi that grow in the deep places where moisture collects and no one cleans. The pain made the journey a waking nightmare, but Tethys kept her hand on my arm, and she moved with a certainty that suggested she could have walked this path blind. She probably had. The space she brought me to was a cistern, old, pre-umbrast, possibly pre-hive, from whatever industrial installation had occupied this ground before the hive swallowed it. A circular chamber, perhaps 15 meters across, with a vaulted ceiling of corroded ferrocrete from which condensation dripped in a steady, arrhythmic patter. The floor was covered in a layer of something soft and yielding that I could not identify in the dim light. Moss, perhaps, or something that had once been moss and had become something else through centuries of isolation in the dark, fed by whatever seeped through the walls. There were people there, 7 of them, sitting in a loose circle on the soft floor, their faces lit by a single chem lantern that had been placed in the center of the space. They looked up when Tethys led me in, and their expressions mirrored hers. Recognition, warmth, welcome, as if they had been expecting me, as if a chair had been left empty at a table and I was simply late to dinner. I saw their bodies. In the dim light of the chem lantern, I could see what Tethys's overcloak had hidden. The discoloration on her hands was not chemical staining. It was the flesh itself, mottled gray-green and black, swollen in places, thinned to transparency in others. Her fingernails were gone. The skin around her knuckles had split and healed and split again, forming ridges of scar tissue that overlapped like the pages of a water-damaged book. The others were similar, or worse. A man with no nose and a smile that reached ear to ear, literally, the cheeks having split open at some point and healed in their open position. A woman whose left arm ended not in a hand, but in a mass of tendrils that might once have been fingers before whatever was inside them decided to keep growing. A boy barely older than the girl I had treated on the day of the purge, whose skin was entirely transparent from the collarbones up, the muscles and veins, and even the curve of the skull visible beneath a membrane that glistened like freshly formed ice. They were rotting. All of them. Visibly, actively, continuously rotting. And they were smiling. Not fixed grins, not the rictus of madness, genuine smiles, the comfortable, easy expressions of people who are exactly where they want to be, doing exactly what they were meant to do. "Sit," Tethys said, and because the pain was all there was and standing required effort I could no longer muster, I sat. The ritual was nothing like the stories that filter through the underhive. No altars, no daggers, no chanting. Tethys knelt behind me and placed her hands on my shoulders. The others closed their eyes. The chem lantern flickered once, and the shadows in the cistern shifted, and I felt, for the first time in 24 days, something that was not pain. It was attention. Something larger than human awareness, something that existed on a scale that the word attention could not contain, the way the word puddle cannot contain the ocean. Something vast and warm and very, very old turned its awareness toward me, and I felt it the way you feel the sun on your skin when you step out of shade. It was curious about me. I could feel that. A gentle, unhurried curiosity, the kind a parent directs at a child who has come home with a scraped knee. simply interested in a fond, paternal way in the small, wounded thing that had been brought to its attention. And it asked me a question. Not in words, not in images. It asked me in the language of the body, the only language that I, in my state, was capable of understanding. It asked me in the sudden, precise cessation of pain in my left hand. Just my left hand. For perhaps 2 seconds, the screaming nerve signals in my left hand went silent, and I felt what my left hand actually felt. The soft surface beneath me, the cool air, the texture of my own trouser fabric where my hand rested on my thigh. Real sensation, undistorted, clear. Then the pain returned and my left hand was gone again, lost in the roaring static of the recordings. But I had felt it. 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, I understood the question. Do you want this? I said yes. I said it with everything I had. Not with words, because words were too small for what I meant. I said it with my nervous system. I said it with every screaming nerve and every firing synapse and every overloaded pain receptor in my body. I said it the way a drowning man says air. Not as a request, as a fact. As the most fundamental truth my body had ever expressed. Yes, please, make it stop. The presence heard me. I know it heard me because the response was immediate, not gradual, not a slow easing, not a gentle fade. Immediate. Between one heartbeat and the next, the pain stopped. All of it. Every signal, every recording, every phantom burn and ghost break and echoed scream. Gone. Cut off as cleanly as if someone had reached into my skull and pulled the wire that connected my brain to my nervous system. One moment I was drowning in agony. The next I was sitting on a soft floor in a dim cistern, and I could feel the condensation dripping on my scalp, and it was cool, and it was real, and it was the only thing I could feel. I did not move for a long time. I sat there breathing, just breathing, feeling the air move in and out of my lungs, feeling the expansion of my ribs, feeling the soft surface beneath me. Each sensation was so clear, so precise, so exquisitely present that I could have wept. I think I did weep. I am not certain. The memory of those first minutes is fragmented, broken up by the sheer overwhelming relief that flooded through me like a river through a breach. Relief is not a strong enough word. There is no word strong enough. Salvation, perhaps. Except that salvation implies being saved from something external, and what I was saved from was myself. Tethys squeezed my shoulders. I felt the pressure, just the pressure. No pain from the force of her grip, no ache from the position I had been sitting in, no residual protest from muscles that had been clenched in spasm for 24 days straight. Just pressure, clean, simple, present. "Welcome home, Drennic," she said. I turned to look at her. In the light of the chem lantern, with the tears still wet on my face, I saw her clearly for the first time. The decay, the swollen joints, the missing fingernails, the skin that was more scar than skin. She was ruined. She was beautiful. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, because she was not in pain, and I was not in pain, and in that moment, that shared absence was more intimate than anything I had experienced in my life. "Thank you," I said. My voice was a rasp. I had screamed it raw days ago, and it had not recovered. But the words came out, and they were the truest words I had ever spoken. Tethys helped me stand. My body protested, not with pain, but with weakness. I had not eaten properly in weeks. My muscles had atrophied. I could barely hold my own weight. But I could stand. I could stand, and I could not feel pain. And for that I would have thanked anything, anyone, Any power in the galaxy, and I did not care what it cost. The others introduced themselves. Karis, the man with no nose and the permanent smile. Helvor, the woman with the tendrils. The transparent boy who went by Jenth and who could not have been more than 16. The others, Pelth, Yvain, Demore, Trask, each with their own decay, their own gifts, as they called them. Each with the same calm contentment in their eyes, each a refugee from pain, collected by Tethys or by each other, brought to the cistern, and offered the same choice. They called themselves the Grateful. I thought the name was apt. The first days were strange. My body was a ruin of neglect and overexertion, and even without pain to contend with, the simple mechanics of recovery were demanding. Tethys had supplies, food, water, basic medicines. Where she got them, I did not ask. Ossivane's philosophy about questions had rubbed off on me. The food was bland, the water tasted of iron, and the medicines were generic low-hive pharmacy stock that would not have impressed a trained chirurgeon, but they were sufficient. I ate. I drank. I slept for the first time in nearly a month, a deep, dreamless, absolute sleep that lasted 14 hours, and from which I woke feeling as if I had been rebuilt from raw materials. The absence of pain redefined everything. I had not realized until it was gone how much of my conscious existence had been structured around the management, avoidance, and accommodation of discomfort. Not just the coil pain. Long before that, the background hum of hive living, the constant low-grade sensory assault of bad air and hard surfaces and inadequate nutrition, the thousand small negotiations that the body makes every day with an environment that is trying, passively and without malice, to break it down. All of that was gone. I existed in a bubble of absolute physical neutrality. Nothing hurt. Nothing ached. Nothing itched, burned, throbbed, stung, or pulled. I was, for the first time in my life, at rest. The food they fed me tasted of nothing. At the time, that made it the finest meal I had eaten in my life, and I was not the only one. The Grateful lived in that cistern the way monks live in a monastery, with routine, with purpose, with a communal rhythm that gave shape to days that might otherwise have dissolved into formlessness. They woke together, ate together, maintained the cistern together. They spoke of the Plague Father with a casual familiarity that reminded me of the way Sunderway families spoke of their neighborhood, with affection and complaint in equal measure, the way you talk about something that is simply and unarguably yours. Nurgle was real to them, not as a doctrine, not as a distant force to be appeased through ritual and sacrifice. Real, the way a parent is real, the way the ceiling above you is real. He was there, in the moisture on the walls, in the soft growth on the floor, in the slow, patient transformation of their bodies, in the flies that appeared one morning around Jenth's head and never left, buzzing in a lazy orbit like electrons around a nucleus. I settled in. There was no formal induction, no oath of allegiance, no blood mark or brand or scarification. There did not need to be. I was there because I had been given the only thing I had ever truly needed, and the source of that gift was not in question. The theology, such as it was, fit on the back of a ration chit. Everything rots. Fighting it hurts. Stop fighting. It was, I will admit, a compelling argument, particularly when delivered by people who were visibly rotting and visibly happy. I had spent my whole life under an emperor who ran on suffering, and here were 8 people in a flooded cistern who had simply stopped paying. I did not examine the argument critically. I was not in a state to. I was in a state of such profound gratitude that I would have accepted anything so long as it came from the hand that had reached into my agony and pulled me out. Pain had opened the door. Gratitude closed it behind me. By the time it might have occurred to me to leave, I had already forgotten that I ever wanted to. I stayed. Weeks became months. The cistern became home. The grateful became family, or the closest approximation of family that a Sunderway man who had never had much use for the concept could construct. I learned their stories. Karras had been a bone cutter in a Hab sector 3 levels above, specializing in the amateur amputation of gangrenous limbs. He had contracted an infection from a patient that had eaten his nose and most of his upper lip before Tethys found him. Helvor had been born with a nerve disorder that caused her hands to convulse in pain at random intervals, a condition that had cost her 3 jobs and 2 marriages before it drove her underground. Jenth had never known a life without pain. He had been born in a chem plant district where the ambient toxin levels caused chronic inflammation in every resident, and his transparent skin was the grandfather's way of showing the world the truth that had always been hidden beneath it. That suffering is visible if you know how to look. Each story was different. Each story ended the same way. Pain, despair, the hand of someone already blessed, reaching down into the dark. And then relief. And then the grateful. I was useful to them. My skills as a dullist, my knowledge of neural architecture and pain response systems gave me an understanding of what Grandfather Nurgle's blessing actually did to the human body that the others lacked. I could explain, in technical terms, how the dampening worked, which nerve pathways had been suppressed, which neurotransmitter cycles had been altered. This was, I think, comforting to some of them. The blessing felt like a miracle. Knowing the mechanism behind it made it feel like medicine. And medicine is easier to trust than miracles. I also began to change. The first sign was the smell. Not the smell of the cistern, which was a rich, loamy, organic scent that I had grown accustomed to. My own smell. My sweat, my breath, the oil on my skin. It shifted, became heavier, earthier, as if something in my biochemistry had been reformulated at a level too deep for conscious awareness. I did not find it unpleasant. Neither did the others. In the grateful, the smell of decay was not a symptom. It was a sign of belonging. Then came the skin changes. Patches of discoloration appeared on my arms and torso, gray-green blotches that looked like old bruises but did not fade. The texture of my skin changed too, becoming softer in places, almost yielding, as if the tissue beneath was losing its structural integrity. I watched this happen with professional interest. I knew what it was. I had read enough about infection pathology in my dulling days to recognize the signs of necrotic progression. My flesh was dying, slowly, selectively, in patches. The dead tissue was not being rejected by my body. It was being incorporated, absorbed, made part of a new architecture that obeyed different rules than the one I had been born with. I could see it happening. I could watch in real time the slow dissolution of the body I had lived in for 32 years, and I could not feel it. Not a twinge, not a whisper. The nerves in the affected areas were as silent as stone. Grandfather's blessing held. The dampening was absolute. I watched my knuckles separate and thought, interesting. I watched a patch of skin on my forearm turn the color of old copper and peel away to reveal a layer of tissue beneath that glistened like wet clay, and I thought, so that is what the subcutaneous layer looks like when it is exposed to air. Months passed. I grew comfortable. I grew complacent. I grew roots in the cistern the way Tethys's garden roots had grown through rock. Slowly, patiently finding the spaces that already existed, I prayed to the Grandfather, not with words, not with ritual, with acceptance, with the quiet daily act of watching myself decay and choosing not to resist it. That was the prayer. That was the only prayer he required. The grateful grew, not rapidly, not conspicuously, but steadily. New converts arrived every few weeks, drawn by the same gravity that had drawn me, the gravity of suffering, finding a drain. We moved from the cistern to a larger space, a disused water treatment facility deeper in the underhive, where dried pools and derelict chambers provided room for the growing congregation. 30 became 50, 50 became 70. Each one a refugee from the Imperium's machine, welcomed and offered the choice. Grandfather Nurgle keeps no waiting list and does not check your documentation. In that, he is already more merciful than the administratum. And then something changed above us. The first sign was a symbol. Trask found it during a surface run, scratched into the metal of a freight corridor wall in the lower hive proper. 3 circles, arranged in a triangle pointing downward, the mark of the Plague Father, but rendered in a style that none of us recognized, deeper gouged, more angular, cut with the kind of force that would require something harder and stronger than any tool a mortal hand should carry. Tethys examined it and said nothing for a long time. Then she sent Trask back to look for more. He found 7, spaced along a route that led from the hive's exterior cargo ports deep into the lower districts. Waymarkers. Someone was coming, or someone had already arrived. The rumors reached us 2 weeks later, filtering down through the underhive's oral network of vagrants and scavengers and people who made their living noticing things that others missed. Armored figures in the deep waste zones, massive bloated shapes moving through corridors that should have been too small to admit them, leaving trails of slime and a smell like an open mass grave. Sounds in the walls at night, the grinding of ceramite on metal, the wet, heavy thud of footfalls too large to be human. Something was operating in the lower reaches of Hive Ulmbrast, and whatever it was, it wore the same mark that Trask had found on the wall. Tethys knew what they were. I could see it in her face, in the way her expression shifted from wariness to something that, on anyone else, I might have called reverence. She did not share the information with the grateful at large, but she began to act differently, more focused, more deliberate, as if she had received instructions that she was not yet ready to relay. And then she told me the truth. It was not a confession. It was not delivered with guilt or shame or the careful hedging of someone who expects to be punished. It was a briefing. Something had arrived in the hive that changed the scope of what the grateful were expected to do, and Tethys needed me to understand what I was before she could explain what I was needed for. We were sitting in the treatment facility, just the 2 of us. The others were above, performing the quiet work that the grateful did, tending to the sick, offering comfort to the desperate, planting seeds in soil that the Imperium had abandoned. It was late. The chem lantern was low. Tethys was mending a tear in her overcloak with the methodical patience that characterized everything she did. And I was examining a new patch of decay on my left shin, observing the way the necrotic tissue had formed a perfect circle around the tibial crest when she spoke. "I need to tell you about the coils, Drennic." I looked up. There was something in her tone that I had not heard before. Not guilt, precision. The careful, measured voice of someone choosing their words with surgical exactness. "The coils ruptured in the purge," I said. "The breach charge knocked them off the shelf." 2 of them, yes. The breach charge knocked 2 of them off the shelf." She set down her mending. "But Drennic, you had 200 coils. They were stored in reinforced casing. A breach charge 2 chambers away should not have been enough to dislodge them. You know this. You built those shelves yourself." I stared at her. The professional part of my mind, the dullist's eye for detail, immediately began reconstructing the event. She was right. The shelves were solid. I had bolted them to the wall at 4 points, and the coils sat in recessed cradles designed to hold them stable during the micro-tremors that were common in the Sunderway. A concussive blast from 2 corridors away would have rattled them. It would not have thrown them. The 2 coils that fell, Tethys continued, were the 2 closest to the edge of the shelf, the 2 that were not in their cradles, because someone had moved them, positioned them where they would fall. The cistern was very quiet. The dripping of condensation sounded like a countdown. The ecclesiarchy purge was real, Tethys said. Confessor Vastrade was a genuine zealot pursuing genuine heretics. I did not create the purge. I could not have. But I knew it was coming. I had been watching the mid-hive covens for months, and I knew the ecclesiarchy was assembling a task force. I knew the trajectory. I knew that the purge would roll downhill, because purges always do. And I knew that when it reached the Sunderway, it would reach you. She paused. I came to your workshop 4 days before the purge began. You were treating a patient. The door was unlocked, as it always was during your working hours. I entered through the back access, the maintenance hatch behind your storage shelf. I moved the 2 highest yield coils out of their cradles and positioned them at the edge, one from a forge serf with 3rd-degree burns across 40% of his body, one from a dock worker who had been crushed between 2 cargo containers and survived with every major nerve cluster in his torso damaged. Between them, they held approximately 60 hours of the most intense pain you had ever recorded. And before I set them at the edge, I scored their casings. A thin cut along the seam, deep enough to weaken the shell, but not deep enough for you to notice on a shelf you passed 100 times a day. The other coils could fall and survive. These 2 could not. I made certain of it. My mouth was dry. My throat worked, but no sound came out. I knew the purge would breach the Sunderway. I knew the breach charges would create concussive shock waves. I knew the shock waves would knock those 2 coils off the unbraced edge of your shelf. And I knew that when they struck the floor, the scored casings would split. And I knew what would happen when 60 hours of recorded agony ruptured in close proximity to a dullist whose neural architecture had been sensitized by years of working with pain-dampening technology. She looked at me. Her eyes, set deep in the ruined topography of her face, were steady and warm. I designed your pain, Drennic. I chose its composition. I chose its intensity. I chose its duration. I calculated, to the best of my ability, exactly how much suffering would be necessary to bring you to the point where you would accept Grandfather's gift. I was his instrument. I was the gardener who tilled the soil. I sat with that for a very long time. The anger should have come. I waited for it. I could feel the shape of where it should have been, a space in my chest, a hollow where fury would have nested if I had been capable of sustaining it. But the hollow was empty. The anger arose and dissipated in the same breath, a spark struck from wet stone. It caught nothing. It lit nothing. It was there and then it was gone. And in its place was something else. Understanding, not forgiveness. I want to be clear about that. I did not forgive Tethys Grawl. Forgiveness implies a moral framework in which what she did was wrong, and I was no longer operating within that framework. I was no longer operating within any framework. Grandfather's blessing had not simply removed my pain. It had removed the scaffolding on which judgments like right and wrong and forgiven and unforgivable were built. The scaffolding was gone. The judgments had nothing to stand on. They fell one by one like tools from a shelf that had lost its bolts. "Why me?" I asked, not as an accusation, as a professional inquiry. Tethys smiled. "Because of what you were, Drennic. A dullist, a man who had spent his life learning to suppress pain. Your neural architecture was unique. Years of working with dampening technology had rewired your brain's pain processing centers in ways that no other profession produces. You were sensitive to pain signals in a way that ordinary people are not. And that sensitivity, once inverted, makes you something extraordinary. What does it make me? A conduit, a vessel. The same neural architecture that allowed you to receive and interpret pain signals with unusual clarity now allows you to channel grandfather's gifts with unusual potency. You are not merely blessed, Drennic. You are a carrier, a seed. Where you go, his garden grows. The gifts that your body produces, the contagions, the blight, the beautiful patient decay, they emanate from you with a strength and a reach that ordinary converts cannot match. Because your nervous system was built to transmit. She reached across the space between us and took my hand. Her fingers, swollen and split and missing their nails, closed around mine with the same steady warmth they had offered on the first day she found me. Grandfather chose you because of what the Imperium made you. The same system that created your pain also created the tool that would deliver his love. That is his way, Drennic. He does not build from nothing. He grows from what already exists. The rot was always in you. I simply helped it bloom." I looked at our joined hands, hers gray-green and mottled, mine beginning to show the same discoloration. In a year, they would look the same. "The others," I said. "Karis, Helvor, Genth. Did you design their pain too?" Tethys shook her head. "No. Their suffering was their own. The Imperium provided it without my assistance. I simply found them in it. You were different, Drennic. You were content. You were functional. Your pain was manageable, distributed across your clients, never accumulating beyond what you could tolerate. You would never have come to Grandfather on your own, because you would never have been desperate enough. You needed to be broken, specifically and deliberately, because the Imperium had not broken you on its own. Not yet." "So you broke me?" "I prepared you. There is a difference. Not from where I was lying." That did get a reaction. A flicker of something in her eyes that might have been regret, though on Tethys's face it was difficult to separate from the general expression of deterioration. She squeezed my hand. "No," she said, "not from where you were lying. That is true. And I am sorry for the pain, Drennic. I am sorry for the 24 days, for the screaming, for the way you bit through your lip and clawed your own skin. If there had been a way to bring you to Grandfather without it, I would have taken it. There was not. Some soil must be broken before it can receive the seed." I sat with that. And then, because I was a dullist, and a dullist understands that the worst part of a procedure is not the cut, but the information that follows it, I asked the question that had been assembling itself in the back of my mind since the moment she began speaking. "How did you know about the coils? How did you know what was in them? Where they were stored? Which ones held the highest yield recordings?" Tethys did not hesitate. "Ossavarn told me." The name hit me the way the coil discharge had hit me. Not with pain, with clarity. A sudden, total, devastating clarity that reorganized everything I thought I knew about my own history. "Ossavarn Kresh was part of my network," Tethys continued. "Not a convert, not a member of the Grateful, a contact, an asset. He had been reporting to me for 2 years before the purge." He was the one who first identified you, Drennic. He told me about the dullist in the Sunderway with the modified neural architecture and the workshop full of pain coils. He described your work in detail, your precision, your sensitivity, the way you could tune a dampening field to target individual nerve clusters. He understood, even without the theological context, that your skills were exceptional, that what the Imperium had accidentally built in you was something unique. And he knew your coils, Drennic. Every one of them. He brokered their sale. He handled each coil, weighed its contents, set its price for the buyers in the mid-hive. He knew which two held the most intense recordings you had ever taken because he was the one who valued them. He told me exactly which two to move and where they sat on your shelf. I did not have to guess. I only had to walk in and lift them. I thought about Korrvaine, his hatchet face, his philosophy about questions. Every one you asked was a debt you might one day be required to repay. He had never asked me questions because he already knew the answers. He had been watching me the way a hunter watches a trail, not with malice, not even with purpose, but with the patient professional attention of someone who has been paid to report what he sees. The penal colony, I said. There was no penal colony. Korrvaine was extracted during the purge. He is alive, elsewhere, doing what he does, finding the next dullist, the next unique architecture, the next seed worth planting. She paused. He was never your friend, Drennic. He was never your enemy. He was a gardener's tool, as was I, as are you now. 3 betrayals, the coils, the pain, the friendship, each one nested inside the other like layers of a diseased organ, each one more intimate than the last. The coils were a mechanism, the pain was a strategy, Korrvaine was personal. He had sat in my workshop and shared meals with me, and laughed at my dry observations about our clients, and known the entire time that he was grooming me for slaughter. I did not know what to say to that. I still do not. She had engineered my destruction with the care and affection of a parent preparing a child for a world she knew would be harsh, and she was sorry about the harshness, but not about the preparation, and she expected me to understand, and the terrible thing, the thing that grandfather's blessing made possible, was that I did. I understood. Not because I agreed, not because I approved, because the capacity to disagree, to disapprove, to feel the visceral, burning rejection that betrayal should provoke, had been quietly excised along with the pain. Grandfather had not just given me numbness, he had given me compliance, and he had done it so gently, so lovingly, so gradually, that I had not noticed the loss until the moment when I needed those feelings and found them missing. That was the true gift, not the absence of pain, the absence of resistance. I sat in the cistern with Tethys, and I understood what had been done to me, and I felt the understanding the way I felt the condensation dripping on my skin, as a sensation, clear and precise, with no emotional weight attached. A fact. Data. Input received and processed and filed. I did not leave. Where would I go? Back to the Sunderway, to the ruin of my workshop, to the silence of a life that no longer existed. Back to the Imperium that had created me and discarded me and would, if it ever noticed me again, execute me for the crime of having found something better than what it offered. There was nowhere to go. There had never been anywhere to go. The trap was not the cistern. The trap was the galaxy. The cistern was the only place in it where the trap's jaws did not close. So I stayed, and I learned. Tethys taught me. Not the theology. I had absorbed the theology through osmosis, through months of living among the grateful and breathing the air of the cistern and watching my body transform. She taught me the practice, the work, the craft of grandfather's service. which was, at its core, the same craft I had always practiced, the management of pain. The only difference was the scale. A dullist works on one patient at a time. He sits a person in a chair, locates the pain, and makes it quiet. A servant of Grandfather Nurgle works on the hive. Not one man's burned hand, but the pain that lives in the walls of the place, the ache in every shift that runs 4 hours long, the grief in every block that loses 6 to the tithe when it was promised 4, the slow, grinding hurt of 10,000 people breathing bad air under a ceiling that will never lift. I had spent my life taking that pain out of people one at a time. Now I offered the same thing to all of them at once. Relief, release, the quiet that comes when you stop fighting what the universe has always been trying to tell you. Everything decays. Everything dies. To resist this is to suffer. To accept it is to be free. I learned the rituals. They were simple, much simpler than the technological procedures I had used as a dullist. They did not require salvaged components or calibrated frequencies or sterile conditions. They required proximity, intention, and time. Grandfather's gifts propagated through contact, through breath, through the simple act of being near someone whose body had become a garden. The contagions were not crude infections. They were invitations. They entered a host and they waited patiently for the host's defenses to exhaust themselves, and then they offered the same choice that Tethys had offered me. Rest, accept, be free. I learned too what Tethys had meant about my unique qualities. The other members of the Grateful were contagious, as all of Grandfather's blessed are, but their contagion had a limited range and a modest potency. Mine did not. The neural architecture that had made me an exceptional dullist, the same sensitivity and precision that had allowed me to manipulate pain signals with unusual skill, now made me an exceptional vector. The contagions I produced were stronger. They propagated faster. They reached further. In a room full of people, my presence alone was enough to begin the process. No contact required, no deliberate transmission. I simply existed, and existence did the rest. Tethys called me a seed. She said that where I was planted, the garden would grow. She said it with pride, with love, the way a mother speaks of a child who has surpassed expectations. She also told me something else, almost in passing, that the deeper the roots grew, the harder the garden was to destroy. She had seen a convert of 20 years walk through a chemical fire in the lower manufactoria and emerge blackened but breathing, the flesh already knitting back in new and unfamiliar patterns. The Grandfather does not abandon what he has planted. I accepted this. I accepted it the way I accepted the rot on my left hand, and the smell of my own decay, and the flies that had begun to orbit my head in the same lazy pattern they traced around Jenths. I accepted it because the part of me that would once have refused, that would have said this is wrong and stopped, had been quietly switched off, and I had not been in the room when it happened. I participated in the Grateful's growth. I sat with new arrivals the way Tethys had sat with me. I held their hands through the worst of it. I told them about the dulling, about the way pain works, about the neural pathways and the dampening frequencies. I gave them the technical explanation alongside the theological one, because some people need to understand before they can accept. And when they said yes, when they made the prayer that is not a prayer, I was there. I was present. And my presence, my proximity, my nature as a seed accelerated the process. Where others needed weeks of exposure, my patients needed days. Where others needed days, mine needed hours. I was good at it, good at converting people to the worship of a chaos god. The same precision, the same care, The same clinical attention to individual need that had made me a good dullist made me a good recruiter. I read people. I understood what they needed to hear. I calibrated my approach the way I had once calibrated my dampening frequencies, differently for each patient, each one tuned to the specific shape of their suffering. I was doing what Tethys had done to me. I knew it while I did it, and the knowing changed nothing. I was manufacturing despair in order to sell relief. The same business I had always run, only the product had changed. Before, I had sold temporary numbness through technology, and my patient's pain came back. Now, the numbness was permanent and the pain never returned. The product was better. The price was merely one's humanity, and in Hive Umbrast, humanity had been priced out of the market long before I started trading. If there was an ember still alive in me under all that numbness, some last coal of conscience the blessing had not smothered, it never got the air to catch. The mission came first. The armored figures in the deep waste zones were the Plague Father's own warriors. Astartes, Tethys called them. The word meant nothing to me at first, but I learned. They were the Emperor's sons who had turned 10,000 years ago and pledged themselves to Grandfather. The things that moved through the waste zones were what remained of that pledge. Massive, rotting, impossibly strong, and utterly devoted. They were operating in the Carfax subsector, and they needed the grateful to perform a specific task. A preparation. A softening of a target that the warriors themselves could not approach without triggering a response that would complicate their campaign. The target was Precinct-Fortress Korrvaine. Arbites. Precinct-Fortress Korrvaine sat on the border between the Sunderway and the lower-hive proper, a squat, ugly, functional block of reinforced ferrocrete and void-shielded walls that housed 300 Adeptus Arbites and their associated support staff. It was the law enforcement hub for the entire lower third of Hive Umbrast. It was well defended, well supplied, and critically, it was the node through which all Arbites communication in the lower hive was routed. If Korrvaine fell or was compromised, the lower hive's law enforcement would be blind, deaf, and headless. The Death Guard wanted it softened, not destroyed, not assaulted, softened. They wanted its garrison weakened, its readiness degraded, its response capability diminished. And they wanted it done from the inside, quietly, without triggering the kind of alert that would bring Astartes or inquisitorial response. They wanted a plague, introduced by a carrier who could pass initial screening. Someone whose body carried contagion potent enough to spread through a sealed, well-maintained facility, but whose external presentation would not immediately mark them as infected. Someone whose neural architecture was so thoroughly dampened that no pain response or discomfort or involuntary tell would betray their condition to a watchful medici. They wanted me. Tethys explained the plan with the same patient, methodical precision with which she explained everything. I would present myself at Korrvaine's intake gate as a displaced underhiver seeking processing and temporary shelter. This was common enough in post-purge Umbrast that it would not raise suspicion. I would be screened, scanned, and admitted to the processing wing, where I would be held with other displaced persons pending documentation and assignment. Standard intake procedure. 3 to 5 days in a communal holding area. 3 to 5 days of my presence in an enclosed, climate-controlled facility full of people. That was all it would take. I simply needed to be there, and the gifts that my body continuously produced would do the rest. The Arbites would begin to weaken. The processing detainees would begin to sicken. The facility's medici would be overwhelmed. and by the time anyone realized what was happening, the infection would be too deeply rooted to eradicate without burning the entire precinct to the ground. I said yes. Of course I said yes. The capacity to say no had been removed along with everything else. Tethys prepared me. Practically, not spiritually. The spiritual preparation was already complete, had been complete since the night in the cistern. The practical preparation involved making me presentable, concealing the visible signs of the blessing. The discoloration on my arms and torso was covered with a thick paste that Tethys mixed from mineral pigments and rendered fat, applied in layers and blended to approximate the sallow, unhealthy complexion of a standard Sunderway resident. The lesions on my shins were hidden by heavy boots. The smell was harder to mask, but not impossible. A thorough scrubbing with industrial cleanser and a change of clothes reduced it to a level that would be dismissed as the general stench of under-hive living. The flies were the most difficult element. They had become my constant companions, a cloud of fat, dark-bodied insects that orbited my head and shoulders in a slow, perpetual circuit. Tethys applied a counter-pheromone distilled from a compound I did not ask about, and the flies dispersed. They went with the sullen reluctance of workers sent home early. I understood the feeling. Temporarily. They would return within a day, she warned. I would need to be inside by then. She also gave me something. A small vial, stoppered with wax, containing a liquid the color of old milk. When the time comes, she said, drink this. It will accelerate the process. What would take days will take hours. I took the vial. I did not ask what was in it. Ossivaine's ghost nodded approvingly somewhere in the back of my memory. The walk to Precinct-Fortress Korrvaine took 6 hours. I moved through the transitional zones between the Sunderway and the lower-hive proper, through corridors that grew steadily better maintained, better lit, more populated. The world changed as I ascended. The metal walls gave way to ferrocrete. The darkness gave way to functional lumen strips. The silence gave way to the constant background noise of hive life. Machinery, voices, the hum of power conduits, the distant rumble of the transit system. People appeared, real people. Hive citizens with work documentation and hab assignments, and lives that the administratum acknowledged. They looked at me the way hive citizens look at underhivers, with the careful blankness that serves as a polite substitute for disgust. I reached Korrvaine at mid-cycle. The precinct fortress was visible from 3 intersections away. A massive block of gray-black ferrocrete that squatted at the junction of 4 major transit corridors, like a predator at a water hole. Its walls were 5 meters thick at the base, studded with sensor arrays and automated defense turrets. The main gate was a slab of reinforced plasteel, flanked by 2 arbites in full carapace armor, their shock mauls holstered but accessible, their helmeted heads tracking every face that passed. The intake queue was long, 30, perhaps 40 people, shuffling forward in the resigned, bovine patience of the Imperial underclass. The Imperium runs on 2 fuels. I had run out of faith some weeks earlier, but the queue was in generous supply. Displaced workers, purge refugees, people whose documentation had been destroyed or confiscated or never existed in the first place. Each one would be processed, scanned, interviewed, assigned a temporary number, and held in the processing wing until the administratum decided what to do with them. Some would be given new documentation and released. Some would be assigned to labor pools. Some would simply be held indefinitely, forgotten by a bureaucracy that processed human beings with the same efficiency and care that it processed sewage. I joined the queue. I looked the part, thin, haggard, wearing the stained coveralls and heavy boots of a Sunderway laborer. My face, still mostly my own despite the encroaching decay, was gaunt from months of intermittent eating. I looked like exactly what I was presenting as, a man who had lost everything in the purge and had nowhere left to go. The processing was thorough but predictable. I was photographed, fingerprinted, questioned, and directed to a medical screening station where a bored chirurgeon ran a standard bioscanner over my body. The scan took 12 seconds. It checked for obvious infections, parasites, toxic contamination, and the most common under-hive diseases. It did not check for Nurgle's gifts. It could not. The contagions of the Plague Father are not bacterial or viral in the conventional sense. They exist at the intersection of the physical and the immaterial, and no standard Imperial medical technology can detect them until the symptoms are already manifest. The chirurgeon looked at the Auspex readout, grunted, and stamped my intake form. I was clean. 12 seconds. That was the sum total of attention Imperial medicine could spare to decide I was no threat to 300 arbites. In fairness to the chirurgeon, he was not wrong about the threat. He was only wrong about its shape. They put me in processing Block 7. Block 7 was a large rectangular chamber, perhaps 30 meters by 20, subdivided by waist-high partitions into sections of 6 cots each. Ventilation came through a shared duct system. Lighting was constant, a flat, buzzing white that made everything look slightly dead. There were approximately 60 people in Block 7 when I arrived, and more coming. Men, women, children, families and individuals, workers and drifters, the full cross-section of hive Ulmbrasts, displaced population, gathered in one enclosed, climate-controlled, well-ventilated space. Well-ventilated. The irony of that did not escape me. I found a cot in the corner. I sat down. I breathed. And the work began. Not through any action of mine. I did not need to act. I simply existed, and my existence was sufficient. Every breath I exhaled carried particles that no Auspex could detect. Every square centimeter of skin that was exposed to the recycled air shed microscopic fragments of the blessing. The ventilation system, designed to maintain air quality for 60-odd people in an enclosed space, distributed those fragments throughout Block 7 with an efficiency that no deliberate delivery system could have matched. The Arbites had built a perfect dispersal mechanism, and they had put me inside it. I sat on my cot and watched. The first day was uneventful. The intake process continued. More people arrived. The block filled. I made no effort to interact with anyone. I did not need to. Proximity was enough. I ate the ration bars they distributed, drank the water from the communal tap, and sat on my cot with the patience of a man who has nowhere to be and nothing to feel. On the second day, I noticed a cough. Not mine. A woman 3 cots down, mid-30s, with the calloused hands and bent posture of a factorum worker. She coughed once, lightly, and touched her throat with a frown. A minor irritation, something in the air. She did not think about it again. On the third day, the cough had spread. 6 people, scattered across Block 7, with the same dry, persistent cough. The sort of cough that sits in the back of the throat and does not quite clear. The block's assigned medici, a junior chirurgeon, who visited twice daily, noted the coughs in his log and recommended increased humidity in the ventilation system. A reasonable response to a reasonable symptom. He did not know what was causing it. He would not know until it was too late. I should tell you what I did on the third day, because it is the moment that matters, the hinge on which this story turns. I went to the communal water tap. It was early, before the main waking cycle, and the block was still mostly asleep. The only other person at the tap was a girl, 11, maybe 12 years old. Small for her age, with the underfed, angular frame of a lower-hive child, and a face that still had the unfinished quality of someone who had not yet decided what kind of person they were going to be. She was filling a cup for her mother, who was sleeping on a cot in the next section. She moved carefully, the way people move when standing upright costs them something. I recognized the posture. I had seen it 1,000 times in my chair. She held her spine very straight, very rigid, compensating for something that bent or twisted when she relaxed. A degenerative condition. Spinal, probably. The kind of thing I could have dulled in 20 minutes, once, in another life. She looked like the girl I had been treating when the purge came. Not the same face, not the same age, but the same posture, the same careful economy of movement, the same eyes, assessing the world through a filter of pain that had been there so long it had become the default setting. She looked at me the way all under-hive children look at adults, reading threat, reading opportunity, in a single glance. She decided I was neither. She gave me a small, cautious nod. Not friendly, not unfriendly, the nod of one inmate to another. I nodded back. She filled her cup and walked away, holding her spine straight, and something moved in me. Not pain. Grandfather's blessing held as firmly as ever. Not guilt, or not exactly guilt. Not the sharp prosecutorial guilt that demands confession and penance. Something subtler. Something that I had thought was gone, excised along with everything else. A tremor deep down beneath the numbness, beneath the dampening, beneath the layers of acceptance and resignation and comfortable decay. Something that looked at this girl, this small, hungry, cautious person carrying water for her mother in a holding cell and said, "She will cough by tomorrow." And a smaller voice, so faint I almost could not hear it, said, "You could stop this." I could. Theoretically. I could stand up, walk to the intake gate, demand to be released and leave. The contagion would stop spreading. Block 7 would recover. The 60-odd people in this room, including a girl with a cautious nod and a mother who was sleeping, would live their miserable hive lives without ever knowing what had almost happened to them. I thought about it. I stood at the water tap and I thought about it the way you think about a mathematical problem. With my mind. With logic. With the cool, analytical precision that grandfather's blessing had not taken from me. Because it was never a threat to begin with. I could see the answer. I could hold it in my mind like a diagram on a data slate. I could examine it from every angle. I should stop. There it was. The correct answer. Clear, unambiguous, morally uncomplicated. I should stop. I should leave. I should not infect 60 people with a supernatural plague that would rot their bodies and consume their souls and transform them eventually into daemonic foot soldiers in the army of a chaos god. I should stop. And then I should feel something about it. Urgency, determination, resolve. The emotional fuel that turns a decision into an action. The fire that burns in the chest when a human being sees a child in danger and moves instinctively before thought can intervene. The fundamental, pre-rational, bone-deep imperative that says, act, now, move. I waited for it. I stood at the water tap, and I waited for the feeling to arrive. The way you wait for a late transit car or for a knock on a door you have been told to expect. I waited, patiently, with the calm expectation of someone who believes that the thing they are waiting for will eventually come. It did not come. The feeling was not there. The space where it should have been was empty, the same way a room is empty after the furniture has been removed. The room still exists. You can see the walls, the floor, the marks where the furniture used to stand. but there is nothing to sit on, nothing to rest against, nothing to do in the empty room except stand in it and note the absence. I should stop, I thought, and the thought had no weight, no force, no urgency. It was a leaf on still water. It was there, and it did nothing, and it did not sink, and it did not move, and it did not matter. I filled my cup. I went back to my cot. I sat down. I breathed. On the fourth day, the girl coughed. I heard it from across the block, a small, dry sound, nothing alarming. She frowned, touched her throat, and went back to eating her ration bar. Her mother looked at her with the automatic concern of a parent who tracks every sound their child makes and then looked away again, reassured by the ordinariness of it. I watched. The girl coughed, and I waited for something inside me to move, the way I had waited at the water tap. Nothing moved. The numbness held. It held the way grandfather's blessings always hold, absolutely, tenderly, without exception. That is what Grandfather Nurgle gives to those who pray for pain to end. He does not merely answer the prayer. He answers every prayer you did not know you were praying. The prayer for the end of fear. The prayer for the end of shame. The prayer for the end of the unbearable weight of being a person in a universe that demands you care about things you cannot change. He takes the pain, and he takes the panic, and he takes the conscience, and he takes the will, and he takes the fire that makes a man, and he replaces it all with the most exquisite, the most beautiful, the most perfectly crafted emptiness you have ever experienced. And you are grateful, because the emptiness does not hurt. On the evening of the fourth day, an Arbitesse clerk walked through Block 7 with a data slate, calling names. Processing complete. Labor pool assignment pending. 6 people, including me, were scheduled for transfer to Hab District Vorren at first light. Standard procedure. My documentation had been processed faster than expected. By morning, I would be out of Block 7, out of the sealed ventilation system, out of the enclosed space where my passive contagion could do its slow, patient work. 5 days in the plan. I was being given 4. The coughing in Block 7 was widespread but mild, a nuisance, not a crisis. If I left now, the medici would prescribe basic antivirals, the coughs would linger and perhaps worsen over weeks. But the Arbitesse would not be incapacitated. The fortress would not be softened. The mission would fail. The passive approach needed more time. Time I no longer had. I did not sleep that night. Before dawn, while the block was still dark and the breathing around me was slow and heavy with the exhaustion of the sick, I took out the vial Tethys had given me. I sat on my cot and I looked at the milky liquid, and I thought about the girl. I thought about her mother. I thought about the 63 people in Block 7, most of whom were coughing now, a persistent spreading symphony of dry throats and rattling chests. I thought about the Arbitesse in their armored corridors beyond the processing wing, 300 men and women whose weapons and training and devotion to the Lex Imperialis would count for nothing against an enemy they could not see and did not know existed. And I thought, this is who I am now. Not, this is what I have become. Not, this is what they made me. This is who I am. The dullist who sold pain. The convert who sold relief. The seed that was planted in prepared soil and grew exactly as designed. And whatever word you want to put on that, victim, instrument, coward, the mechanics do not change. I chose every time. I chose when I sold the coils. I chose when I said yes to Tethys. I chose when I walked through the gate of Precinct-Fortress Korrvaine. I chose when I stood at the water tap and did nothing. Every choice was the only one I could have made, arranged for me in advance by people who knew exactly which way I would move. And my hand still moved. My mouth still opened. No one held a blade to my throat. Grandfather does not enslave, he cultivates. I am no longer certain those are different things. It does not matter. I uncorked the vial. The liquid smelled of nothing, of absolute nothing, the absence of scent in a world where everything I was and everything I touched reeked of decay. It was the cleanest thing I had encountered in months. I drank it. The effect was not immediate. It built over the course of the next 2 hours, a slow intensification that I could observe but not feel, like watching a fire grow from across a river. My skin flushed. The discoloration spread, creeping visibly across my forearms, my neck, my face. The paste Tethys had applied cracked and flaked away as the flesh beneath it swelled and softened. The lesions on my shins opened. The flies returned, materializing from thin air as if they had been waiting just outside the walls for the signal to come home. They settled on my shoulders, my arms, the exposed patches of decay. And they buzzed, and the buzzing was the only sound in the galaxy that felt like it belonged to me. The people on the cots nearest to me noticed first. A man, 2 cots over, stared at my face with growing alarm. I do not know what he saw. I could not see myself, but I could see his reaction, the way the color drained from his skin and his mouth opened, and his hands gripped the edges of his cot as if he was trying to hold himself in place against a strong wind. He did not scream. He should have. Instead, he coughed. A deep, wet, productive cough that sprayed a fine mist of blood-flecked mucus into the recycled air of Block 7. And then the woman next to him coughed, and the man beyond her, and the child, and the mother. And one by one, cot by cot, section by section, the room erupted into a chorus of coughing that sounded like the clearing of a throat the size of a world. I sat on my cot. I watched. The numbness held, the silence held. The girl was coughing, her small body convulsing with the force of it, and her mother was holding her and coughing too, and the ration bar had fallen from the girl's hand and landed on the floor, where it lay in a spreading puddle of something that seeped from the walls and the floor and the very air itself, something warm and thick and alive with purpose. The block's door lumen turned red. Lockdown. The Arbites had detected something, some automated sensor tripped by the sudden spike in biological distress. But lockdown meant sealing the ventilation system, containing the contamination, keeping it in with me, with 63 people who were now breathing air so thick with grandfather's gifts that every inhalation was a benediction. I should tell you what happened next. I should describe the deterioration, the screaming, the pounding on the sealed doors, the look on the junior chirurgian's face when he arrived in his hazmat suit and saw what Block 7 had become in the space of 2 hours. I should describe the children. I will not. Not because I cannot. Because there are things that do not deserve the dignity of narration. Things that happen in silence, witnessed only by the guilty and the dying, and to put them into words would be to give them a shape and a meaning that they do not have. What happened in Block 7 was not a story. It was a process, a biological inevitability set in motion by a man sitting on a cot. It had no climax, no resolution, no moral. It simply happened. The way rot happens. The way things fall apart. I will tell you instead about the sound. After the coughing stopped, after the screaming stopped, after the pounding on the door stopped, and the ventilation system cycled, and the air cleared, and the only movement in Block 7 was the slow settling of things that had once been people into configurations that were not quite still. The sound was buzzing. Flies. Thousands of them. Millions, perhaps, filling the block in a cloud so thick that the lumen strips above were reduced to dim, diffuse points of light. The buzzing was not random. It had a rhythm, a pattern, a frequency that resonated in my chest and my skull, and the hollow spaces where my emotions used to live. It sounded like a lullaby. I sat on my cot, the only figure in Block 7 still recognizably human, still recognizably upright, still recognizably alive in the conventional sense of the word. I sat, and I listened to the lullaby, and I felt nothing. And nothing, by then, was the only thing left that felt like home. Peace. Not the bright, sharp ecstasy of triumph or connection. The deep, terminal peace of a body that has stopped fighting itself, that has settled at last into the certainty that this is all there is, and this is enough. The doors opened eventually. The Arbiters came in force. Full hazmat protocols, flamers, decontamination units. They found me sitting on my cot, surrounded by the dead, covered in flies, smiling. They did not understand the smile. They could not. It was not a smile of triumph or cruelty or madness. It was the smile of a man who has finally, after a lifetime of looking, found the answer to a question he did not know he was asking. They burned Block 7. They burned it with me in it. The flamers roared, and the dead burned, and the flies burned, and I burned, and I felt nothing. The fire consumed my skin and my muscle and my fat and my organs, and I watched it happen with the same clinical interest with which I had watched my knuckles separate 3 days ago, which was the same clinical interest with which I had watched the girl cough, which was the same clinical interest with which I had watched my life disintegrate around me, piece by piece, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but the watching. They burned me. My body blackened, my flesh cracked and peeled and fell away, and I did not die. Grandfather's blessing held, even in the fire, even as my body was reduced to something that no longer resembled a man. The blessing held. The nerves were silent. The pain was absent. And the things that grew in the spaces where my organs had been, the soft, wet, persistent things that pushed through the charred meat and the blackened bone and reached for the air with the blind, patient tenacity of roots through rock. Those things were not mine. They were his. They had always been his. I had simply been the soil in which they waited. I am still here. Not in Block 7. Block 7 is ash. Precinct-Fortress Korrvaine is silent. Something happened to Hive Olmbrast after I left. I can hear it in the changed patterns of the Hive's heartbeat, in the sealed bulkheads I find where open corridors used to be, in the kill teams that sweep the deep levels with weapons too specialized for Arbiters. Someone with authority beyond the local garrison has taken an interest. It does not matter. My part is done. But I am still here. What remains of me is not a body. Not exactly. It is a thing that was once a body and has become something else. Something that moves through the deep places of the hive with a purpose that is not mine and a patience that is not human. I have one eye now. The left one closed weeks ago, the lid fusing to the socket in a ridge of yellowed tissue. And what grew in behind the sealed flesh is not an eye at all, but something that sees differently, that perceives the world in spectrums of decay and vitality and ripeness. My skin is a map of a country that does not exist on any Imperial chart. Gray-green continents of necrotic tissue separated by rivers of exposed muscle and fjords of bone. A single horn has begun to push through the skin above my remaining eye, slow and steady, curving forward like the prow of a ship. I know what I am becoming. Tethys told me once. She described the plague-bearers, the talisman of Nurgle, the lesser demons that are born from the souls of mortals consumed by the grandfather's rot. She spoke of them with the warmth of a woman describing her grandchildren. The Arbiters have designated me Biohazard Sigma-7. They are hunting me with kill teams and purification squads, and the kind of focused institutional violence that the Imperium reserves for the things it fears most. They will not find me. I am too deep. I am in the places where the hive meets the earth, where the ferrocrete gives way to bedrock, and the bedrock gives way to something older and softer and more welcoming. I leave trails where I walk, not footprints. Growth. The stone behind me blooms with fungal carpets that were not there an hour before. The metal walls weep condensation that smells of rich earth and sweetness. Insects appear in my wake, species that have no names in any Imperial catalog, fat and iridescent, buzzing hymns in frequencies that human ears are not designed to receive. I should feel something about this, about what I did, about the 63 people in Block 7, about the girl with the cautious nod and the bad spine, carrying water for her mother, about Tethys, who designed my pain with love and planted me like a seed with pride, about Ossivan, who watched me from across a shared meal and calculated my worth in a currency I did not know existed, about the Imperium, which created a machine that produces suffering and then acts surprised when someone offers an alternative, about Grandfather Nurgle, who reached into my agony and pulled me out and held me close and whispered, "Rest, child, rest," and meant every word and meant also, "Now rest them too." I should feel something. The knuckle on my left hand is gone now. The finger followed it 2 days ago. The hand is next. I can map the progression the way I used to map a patient's pain pathways, methodically, precisely, with professional attention to detail. The decay is accelerating. What took months now takes days. What took days will soon take hours. Somewhere in the warp, in the garden of Nurgle, a fruit is swelling on a bough of a rotting tree, fed by my soul the way a tick feeds on blood. When the last of me is consumed, when the fruit is ripe and heavy and ready to burst, the thing inside it will slip into existence, and it will wear my memories like a borrowed coat, and it will serve the Plague Father in legions beyond counting, and Drennic Vosh will be a word that means nothing, spoken by no one, remembered by nothing except the garden that grew from his bones. I can almost see it sometimes. In the darkness of the deep places, when the hive is quiet, and the only sound is the buzzing of the flies that are my constant, faithful companions. I can almost see the garden, the dark, rich soil, the tangled, dripping canopy, the willow trees with their rotting boughs, heavy with fruit, the things that grow there, patient and persistent and very, very alive. It looks like home. And the last thought I will have, the last coherent impulse of the thing that was once Drennic Vosh, dullist of the Sunderway, is this. I asked him to take the pain away, and he did. He took all of it. The pain of my body, the pain of my conscience, the pain of watching a child die, the pain of knowing I could have stopped, the pain of choosing not to. He took it all. He left me nothing. And nothing, it turns out, is exactly what peace feels like. Tell me that is not a mercy. You cannot.